The alarm on my desk screamed before I even opened my eyes that morning, and I knew, somehow, that the sound meant the end of something. I am Aldrich Venn, senior delegate of the Threll Assembly, and I had spent 11 years building the case that would finally remove humanity from the Interstellar Council. That morning, the case was going to win. I had the votes. I had the fear of 18 worlds behind me, and I had a single, clean sentence prepared for the record. Humanity is a danger the galaxy can no longer afford to seat at its table. I did not know yet that within a season, I would be the one begging them to come back. The council chamber on Vesson Station was a ring of light suspended above a dead moon, built so that no single species could claim the center of the room. 900 delegates sat in tiers of transparent glass, and at the center of it all stood the human seat, empty that morning because the human ambassador, a woman named Dana Rourke, had not yet arrived. She was, as always, late by exactly 4 minutes, an old military habit she never explained and never apologized for. When she walked in, the room went quiet, in the particular way rooms go quiet around people who have never needed to raise their voice to be heard. She did not look nervous. She looked like a woman attending a funeral she had already grieved. I stood to open the session, because the motion to expel humanity from full council membership was mine, and mine alone, to present. My hands did not shake. I want to be honest about that, because everything I am about to tell you happened because I was so certain, so completely certain, that I was doing something brave. I read the charges aloud. I spoke of the war games humanity ran twice a year, exercises so aggressive that 3 neighboring species had filed formal protests. I spoke of the growth of their shipyards, the strange joy they seemed to take in armor plating and weapon load calculations, the songs their soldiers sang that other species found unsettling rather than inspiring. I spoke of a species that had clawed its way out of a single dying world through 2 centuries of conflict with itself, and I asked the council a simple question. Do we want that history sitting beside us with a vote and a fleet? Nobody clapped. Nobody ever claps in that chamber. But I felt the agreement in the room like a change in air pressure. Dana Rourke did not stand to argue with a single fact I presented. That was the strangest part. She let every word I said sit in the record, unchallenged, because none of it was false. Instead, she asked for 2 minutes, and the council granted them, more out of curiosity than courtesy. She said that she would not defend her people's temperament, because temperament was not the argument that mattered. She said that for the past 11 years, human ships had been quietly stationed along 7 contested borders that the council never officially acknowledged as dangerous. She said that on 412 occasions, human vessels had responded to distress calls that no other fleet was close enough, or willing enough, to answer. She said this without pride, the way someone reads a weather report. Then she said the sentence I would remember for the rest of my life. You will regret the quiet. I remember laughing under my breath, not cruelly, just the small, involuntary laugh of a man who believes he has already won an argument that the other side is too proud to concede. The council called the vote within the hour. 211 worlds in favor of removing humanity's council seat and revoking their treaty access to the interior systems. Only 19 worlds voted against it, and every one of those 19 worlds, I would later learn, had a human fleet quietly protecting a border they never wanted the rest of us to know was under threat. Dana Rourke did not argue the outcome. She stood, straightened her uniform, and asked for one final courtesy before the session closed. 48 hours to withdraw all human assets from council-monitored space, so that no one could later claim humanity had abandoned a post without warning. The council granted it, mostly because nobody expected the withdrawal to matter. I want to tell you clearly, because I think about it every single day now, that I felt nothing but relief walking out of that chamber. I remember stopping by the observation deck and looking down at the dead moon below the station, thinking that the galaxy had just become a calmer, safer place. I remember telling my aide, a bright young Threll named Corin Ashwood, that history would remember this as the day the council chose peace over fear. Corin did not share my confidence. She had spent the last 2 years cataloging human patrol routes for an unrelated trade report, and she mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that she had never been able to explain why 3 of the routes she mapped led to systems with no recorded human settlements at all. I told her it did not matter anymore. Whatever those routes had been protecting, it was no longer the Council's business. That night, for the first time in 11 years, I slept without the low, constant hum of anxiety that had followed me since I began building the case against humanity. I remember thinking the silence felt like victory. 48 hours later, I stood on the same observation deck and watched the withdrawal happen exactly as promised. There was no dramatic gesture, no parting insult. Just an orderly formation of gray and white human vessels folding out of Council space, one sector at a time, moving with the same quiet discipline they had always shown in every joint exercise I had criticized as excessive. The last ship to leave was the flagship, a vessel called the Meridian, and as it crossed the boundary line into unclaimed space, every sensor grid the Council maintained in that sector went dark for exactly 3 seconds. Nobody at the time thought that was significant. I certainly did not. I assumed it was some parting technical courtesy, a final handshake between departing systems. I did not know that those 3 seconds of darkness were the last moment the Council would ever see clearly into a region of space that had been silently defended for over a decade. The following morning, I gave a public address to the Threll home system, celebrating what I called a return to balance. I spoke about the courage it takes for a civilization to say no to a dangerous ally, even one that has never technically broken a single treaty. I remember the applause. I remember feeling, for the first time in my long career, like a leader instead of a bureaucrat. It took 11 days for the first cracks to appear, and even then, none of us recognized them for what they were. A shipping consortium operating along the Varan corridor filed a routine complaint that their scheduled escort had failed to arrive. This was not unusual on its own. Escorts were rotated constantly among member species, and delays happened. What was unusual was the response from the scheduling office, a division I had never had reason to think about before that week. The office reported, almost apologetically, that the escort roster for that corridor had listed a human vessel for the past 6 years, and that no other fleet had been formally assigned to replace it, because no other fleet had ever needed to be assigned. The human ship had simply always been there. I remember reading that report and feeling a small, cold seed of doubt plant itself somewhere behind my ribs. I told myself it was an administrative oversight, the kind of gap that always appears when any large system changes hands. I ordered the scheduling office to reassign a Threll vessel to the corridor within the week, and I moved on with my day. 3 days later, a council auditor named Petra Lindquist requested a private meeting with me, which struck me as strange, only because Petra had never once, in the 4 years I had known her, requested anything privately. She was blunt to the point of rudeness, and she liked her reports public, because she believed sunlight was the best form of accountability. When she sat down across from me, she did not smile. She told me that she had spent the past week trying to reconcile the Council's official defense budget with the actual patrol coverage across our monitored systems, a routine task she performed every quarter. This quarter, the numbers did not reconcile. Not by a small margin either. By her calculation, the Council's combined fleets, every species included, covered barely 60% of the space that had been considered secured the month before. When she asked her staff to explain the missing 40%, the answer she received, over and over, was some version of the same sentence. That sector was human coverage. I remember staring at her, trying to find the flaw in what she was saying, because it did not match the story I had told myself, and told an entire star system, only 12 days earlier. I asked her how a single species could possibly account for 40% of council-wide security coverage without a single formal announcement of that fact. She looked at me the way a teacher looks at a student who has just asked a question with an answer he does not want to hear. She said humans had never announced it because nobody in this chamber ever asked them what they were doing. We assumed the quiet space between our official patrol routes was simply quiet. We never once considered that someone was making it quiet on our behalf. I asked her to keep the report contained until I had time to review it properly. She agreed, reluctantly, and left my office with the particular expression of someone who believes she has just handed a warning to a person who will not listen to it. She was, unfortunately, exactly right about that. I spent that night reviewing the raw sensor data from the week following the human withdrawal, something I had not bothered to do before because I had no reason to expect anything unusual. What I found unsettled me in a way that facts on a page are not supposed to be able to do. Along 3 of the corridors Corin Ashwood had once flagged in her trade report, the ones with no recorded human settlements, there had been a sudden spike in unidentified vessel activity within 72 hours of the withdrawal. The Council's sensor network picked up the activity, but had no protocol in place to respond to it, because the response protocol, I now understood with a sinking feeling, had never belonged to the Council at all. It had belonged to ships that no longer existed on our side of the boundary. I did not sleep that night. I sat at my desk and read through old joint exercise logs, the same ones I had used as evidence against humanity only weeks earlier, and I began to notice something I had somehow missed every single time I had reviewed them before. The exercises were not simply displays of aggression, the way I had described them to the Council. Every single one of them had a shape, a pattern. They were rehearsals, again and again, for defending specific borders against specific kinds of incursion. I had called it excessive posturing. I was starting to understand that it might have been preparation. By the end of that week, 3 more shipping consortiums had filed complaints about missing escorts. A small mining colony on the edge of the Varan corridor reported an unidentified vessel entering its outer scanning range and then withdrawing without explanation, an event its administrator described, almost casually, as the first such incident in over a decade. I remember reading that line and feeling the cold seed of doubt in my chest grow into something heavier. I called an emergency session of the Security Subcommittee, quietly, without informing the full Council, because I was not yet ready to admit publicly that the vote I had championed might have created a problem rather than solved one. Petra Lindquist attended, along with 3 delegates from species whose systems bordered the corridors in question. None of them had good news. A Varan delegate named Oscar Thane reported that patrol requests from his home system had tripled in the last 2 weeks, a fact his government had assumed was simply a statistical anomaly, until he cross-referenced it against the timeline of the human withdrawal and found the correlation impossible to ignore. A delegate from a smaller trade collective, a soft-spoken woman named Ines Calder, said that 2 independent traders had already gone missing along routes that had been, in her words, boringly safe for as long as anyone could remember. I sat through that meeting mostly in silence, because I did not yet know how to say out loud the thing I was beginning to understand. I had spent 11 years building a case against a threat that, it now seemed, had spent the same 11 years quietly absorbing threats on our behalf, without asking for credit, without asking for gratitude, and without ever once telling us how much of the galaxy's peace depended on their presence. When the meeting ended, Petra stayed behind. She did not say "I told you so," though she would have been entitled to. She simply asked me one question, and it was the same question that would follow me for the rest of this account. She asked me whether I had ever, in 11 years of building my case, asked a single human officer what exactly they had been protecting us from. I had not once. I had built an entire argument on what humanity might become, and I had never once asked what they had already quietly prevented from happening to the rest of us. I left that meeting and walked back to the observation deck where, 12 days earlier, I had watched the meridian cross the boundary line with something like pride in my chest. The dead moon below the station looked exactly the same as it had that day. The stars beyond it looked exactly the same, but I no longer felt calm looking at them. I felt, for the first time since the vote, that I had made a decision I did not fully understand the size of, and that the true cost of that decision had not even begun to arrive yet. I did not know, standing there that night, that within a month, a colony that had never taken human warnings seriously would learn exactly what that cost looked like. I did not know that the silence I had celebrated as peace was, in fact, the sound of a wall being quietly removed from a house none of us had realized was still standing because of it. I only knew, in that moment, that the seed of doubt Petra Lindquist had planted in my chest was growing roots faster than I could pull them out, and that somewhere beyond the boundary line, Dana Rourke and her people were no longer our problem to worry about, and no longer our shield to depend on, and no longer anything to us at all, except a species we had voted, with 211 confident votes, to send away. The quiet Dana Rourke had warned me about had already begun. I simply did not yet know how loud it was about to become. The silence I had noticed in those first 2 weeks was nothing compared to what I began hearing, or rather, not hearing, once I started actually looking for it. I asked Corin Ashwood to compile a full record of every frequency human ships had ever monitored. Not the official ones listed in council registries, but the informal ones, the channels traders and small colonies used when something felt wrong and they needed someone to answer quickly. It took her 4 days to build the list, because nobody had ever bothered to write it down properly. Humans, it turned out, had never needed a formal directive to listen. They simply always had someone awake, somewhere, on a channel nobody else thought was worth staffing. When Corin finished the list, she brought it to me with an expression I had never seen on her before. She looked like someone who had just realized a building she walked through every day had no foundation she could see. She told me that of the 41 informal channels she identified, 38 had gone completely silent within 72 hours of the human withdrawal. Not decommissioned, not reassigned, simply empty, because the people who had always answered them were gone, and nobody else had ever thought to ask who should replace them. I remember asking her what happened on those channels now, when someone called in with a problem. She told me, quietly, that mostly nothing happened at all. The calls went out into the dark and were never answered, because the council had never built a formal system for something that had always, without anyone noticing, been handled informally by a species we had just voted out of the room. That same week, a courier from the Varen corridor filed a report describing an encounter with an unfamiliar vessel that had approached, scanned, and then withdrawn without any hostile action. On its own, this might have meant very little. But it was the fourth such encounter in 10 days, all in systems that bordered territory, controlled by an empire we called the Kryn Ascendancy, a name I had heard mentioned in passing for years, without ever giving it much serious thought. I want to be honest about how little the Kryn Ascendancy had mattered to my daily concerns before that point. They were, in council records, listed as a non-aligned power with a history of border disputes, described in the dry language bureaucrats use for problems they have decided are not currently urgent. I had read exactly one report about them in the past 3 years, and it concluded that their expansion had been effectively contained for over a decade by what the report vaguely called regional deterrence measures. I had never once asked what those measures were, or who was providing them. Petra Lindquist, to her credit, asked exactly that question, and she did not wait for permission to find the answer. She pulled every archived council transmission mentioning the Kryn Ascendancy going back 15 years, cross-referenced them against fleet movement logs, and brought the results to my office on a morning I remember clearly because it was raining on Vesson Station, an artificial weather cycle we rarely used, except to mark something significant. She told me that in every single recorded instance of Kryn aggression along the border for the past 11 years, a human vessel had appeared within hours, sometimes minutes, of the incident being logged, not council ships, not joint fleets acting under any authorized mandate. Human ships, operating quietly, without formal orders from anyone but their own command structure, doing exactly what Dana Rourke had described in that 2-minute speech I had barely listened to before the vote. I asked Petra the obvious question: why had none of this ever been formally reported to the council? She looked at me for a long moment before answering, and her answer has stayed with me every day since. She said that reporting it would have required someone to admit that an entire border region's safety depended on a single species acting without oversight, without formal authority, and without asking for anything in return. She said most delegates, myself included, would rather not know that kind of thing, because knowing it would have made the vote I championed impossible to justify. I sat with that for a long time after she left. I thought about the war games I had described to the council as excessive, the ones that had, I now understood, been rehearsals for exactly this kind of quiet defense. I thought about the songs their soldiers sang, the ones other species found unsettling, and I wondered for the first time whether those songs had simply been the sound of people preparing themselves, again and again, for a job nobody else in the galaxy was willing to do. 10 days after that conversation, the Kryn Ascendancy tested our border for the first time since the withdrawal, not with a single scout vessel, but with a formation of 6 armed ships that entered a system called Adral Hollow, a modest agricultural colony belonging to the Varen, and remained there for 11 hours before withdrawing. No shots were fired. No formal declaration was made, but the message was unmistakable, and everyone on Adral Hollow understood it long before the council did. I remember the transmission that came through from the colony's administrator, a Varen woman named Sela Prin, because it was the first time I heard genuine fear in an official council channel since the vote. She said that in the 11 years she had governed that colony, they had faced exactly 2 incidents of this kind, both more than a decade earlier, both resolved within hours by a human patrol that arrived so quickly the colony barely had time to raise an alert. This time, she said, they had raised the alert immediately, and nothing had come. She asked the council, directly and without diplomatic softening, what exactly we intended to do about a border that had apparently never been ours to secure in the first place. Nobody on the security subcommittee had a good answer. Oscar Thane proposed reallocating a Varan fleet to cover the corridor permanently, a proposal that sounded reasonable until Petra pointed out that the Varan fleet in question was already stretched across 4 other regions and had no capacity to take on a 5th without abandoning something else. Ines Calder suggested a joint multi-species patrol, cobbled together from whichever fleets could spare a vessel, which sounded like a solution until someone calculated that it would take at least 6 weeks to organize, coordinate protocols across 4 different command structures, and actually deploy, an eternity compared to the hours it had once taken a single human vessel to respond. I sat through that meeting feeling something I had never felt in my career before, not fear exactly, something closer to the specific shame of realizing that a decision you were proud of had been built entirely on not asking the right questions. I went back that night and reread the transcript of my own speech to the council, the one where I had spoken of humanity's growing military reach, as though it were a threat aimed at the rest of us. I had used the phrase clawed its way out of a single dying world, and I had meant it as an accusation, evidence of a violent history that made humanity dangerous company. Reading it again, with everything I now understood, it read differently. It read like a description of the only species in the galaxy that had ever actually needed to learn how to survive without anyone else's help, and who had, without ever announcing it, quietly extended that same protection to the rest of us for over a decade. I began, quietly, to reach out to contacts I had cultivated over the years, hoping someone could tell me anything at all about where the human fleet had actually gone after the withdrawal. Most of what I found was rumor, second-hand and unreliable. But one report, from a trade envoy who had crossed paths with a human supply vessel near the boundary line, described something that stayed with me. The envoy said the ship's crew had not seemed angry, or bitter, or eager to say anything critical of the council at all. They had simply seemed unburdened, in a way the envoy found strange to describe, like people who had set down a weight they had carried for so long they had forgotten it was heavy. That description troubled me more than anger would have. Anger, at least, would have meant they still cared what we thought of them. Unburdened meant something else entirely. It meant they had already moved on, and that whatever the rest of us were about to face without them, we would be facing it alone, because humanity no longer considered our safety part of their responsibility. By the end of that second week, 3 more colonies along contested borders had reported unusual activity, and the shipping consortium that had first raised the alarm about missing escorts filed a formal complaint demanding the council explain, in writing, exactly which fleet was now responsible for corridor security. I was asked, as the delegate who had championed the original expulsion vote, to draft the response. I remember sitting at my desk for nearly 6 hours trying to write that letter, because every honest sentence I attempted led to the same uncomfortable conclusion. There was no fleet responsible for that corridor anymore. There never really had been, not in the way the council understood responsibility, built on treaties and formal mandates and public accountability. There had only ever been Dana Rourke's people, quietly doing the job because they had decided, on their own, that it needed doing, and asking for nothing from us in return except, apparently, the basic courtesy of not being expelled for it. I never sent that letter. I could not find a way to write it that did not amount to an admission that the vote I had led the council toward had removed the only real protection several of our border systems had ever had. Petra Lindquist, when I told her this, did not look surprised. She simply asked me what I intended to do about it, and for the first time since the vote, I did not have an answer that sounded like leadership. I only had a question, the same one that had been growing in my chest since the observation deck, since the dead moon that looked exactly the same as it always had, while everything beneath it quietly began to change. What, exactly, had we assumed was keeping us safe, and why had it taken losing it for any of us to ask? The word Kryn had meant almost nothing to me a month earlier. By the third week after the withdrawal, it was the only word anyone on the security subcommittee wanted to discuss, and every conversation about it left the room a little more frightened than the last. I asked Petra Lindquist to compile everything the council actually knew about the Kryn ascendancy, separate from the vague regional deterrence language that had satisfied everyone for years. What she brought back was thinner than I expected, and far more disturbing. The Kryn were not a large empire in terms of territory. What they were, according to 3 separate intelligence summaries buried in archives nobody had opened in years, was efficient in a way that unsettled even the analysts who studied them. Their expansion, when unchecked, had historically followed a consistent pattern: identify a weakly defended border, test it repeatedly with small incursions, withdraw the moment resistance appeared, return, weeks or months later, in greater force, once they had confirmed the resistance was not sustained. 11 years earlier, according to the oldest report in that file, the Kryn had attempted exactly this pattern against the Varan border, the same corridor now sitting exposed since the human withdrawal. The report noted, almost in passing, that the pattern had stopped abruptly after a series of encounters with an unidentified fleet that the Kryn apparently decided was not worth continuing to test. The report never named that fleet. It did not need to. I already knew. I brought this to the full security subcommittee, and for the first time since the vote, I watched delegates who had cheered my speech a month earlier go quiet in a way that had nothing to do with agreement. Oscar Thane, who represented the Varan most directly affected by the exposed corridor, asked the question that had been sitting unspoken in the room for days. If the Kryn had once tested this border and been turned away by a fleet that no longer existed here, what exactly did we think would happen once they finished testing it again? Nobody answered him directly, because the answer was already unfolding in real time. 3 days after that meeting, a joint Varan and Threll monitoring post at the edge of a Drell Hollow detected a Kryn formation nearly twice the size of the one that had entered the system 2 weeks earlier. This time, they did not simply enter and withdraw. They remained in the outer system for nearly 4 days, moving slowly, deliberately, in a pattern one analyst described as reconnaissance rather than provocation. They were not testing whether we would respond. They already suspected we could not. They were confirming it. I remember the emergency session that followed, because it was the first time I saw genuine panic replace the confident, deliberate tone the council usually maintained. Selah Prynn, the administrator from Adrel Hollow, addressed the chamber directly, and her voice shook in a way that made the entire room fall silent. She said her colony had, for the first time in over a decade, begun evacuating non-essential personnel to interior systems, not because the council had advised it, but because her own defense staff, all 4 of them, had told her plainly that they had no way to stop a formation that size if it decided to stop testing and start acting. I asked, quietly, whether any species on the council had a fleet capable of reinforcing that corridor within the week. The answer, delivered by 3 different delegates in 3 different ways, amounted to the same thing. No one did. Not without abandoning coverage somewhere else, and every delegate present had already begun quietly worrying about their own exposed borders, because the Kryn were not the only power humanity had apparently been holding back without our knowledge. Petra's continued research, which she now conducted with something close to obsession, turned up 2 more regions where the same pattern applied. A pirate confederation operating along a mining corridor claimed by a smaller species called the Denar had, according to her records, gone almost entirely quiet for 9 years, following an incident where 3 of their vessels vanished attempting to raid a convoy that turned out to be escorted by an unmarked human ship. The Denar had never known why the raids stopped. They had simply been grateful. The third region was worse, because it involved something none of us had even known existed. Buried in a decommissioned council security file, one Petra had to request special clearance to access, was a record of a containment operation conducted nearly 7 years earlier, involving a cache of biological agents recovered from an abandoned research station on the edge of neutral space. The file was heavily redacted, but what remained made clear that a human vessel had responded to the discovery, secured the site, and quietly transferred the material to a facility for destruction, all without any formal council notification, because, the file noted in its final unredacted line, formal notification would have triggered a multi-species jurisdictional dispute that could have delayed containment by months. I read that line more than once. Months of delay, for material that could have, left unsecured, poisoned an entire system. Humanity had made a decision, on their own authority, to prioritize the actual safety of a region over the bureaucratic process the rest of us would have insisted on. And they had never once used that decision as leverage against us, never mentioned it in a single council session, never asked for credit or gratitude or even acknowledgement. They had simply done it and moved on, the same unburdened way the trade envoy had described the crew of that supply vessel near the boundary line. I brought all 3 findings to a private meeting with the council's presiding officer, an elder thrall named Ambassador Corwin Vale, a man who had chaired the chamber for over 20 years and had voted, like nearly everyone else, in favor of the expulsion. I expected him to dismiss the findings, or at least to defend the vote the way I had defended it to myself for weeks. Instead, he sat quietly for a long time after I finished, staring at the same dead moon visible from his office window, and then he said something I have never forgotten. He said that the worst mistakes a civilization makes are rarely the ones built on malice. They are the ones built on convenience, on the comfortable assumption that someone else is handling the hard, ugly parts of survival, so the rest of us never have to look at them directly. I asked him what he intended to do. He told me, with the particular exhaustion of a man 20 years into a job he had thought he understood, that he intended to convene a full council session and present everything we had found, without softening it, without protecting the reputations of anyone who had voted for the expulsion, including his own. He said the council owed the truth to the colonies now sitting exposed, even if the truth made every one of us look like fools. That session took place 4 days later, and it remains, to this day, the most difficult 2 hours I have ever spent in that chamber. Ambassador Vale laid out the findings plainly. 11 years of quiet containment along the Varan corridor. 9 years of quiet deterrence protecting the Denar mining routes. A biological containment operation that could have ended in catastrophe, handled quietly and without credit. He did not spare himself from the conclusion. He said plainly that the council had voted to remove the one force that had, without our knowledge or consent, been holding back 3 separate threats we had never even known were being held back. Sayla Prin, still connected to the session remotely from an increasingly nervous Adrel Hollow, asked the only question that mattered by that point. She asked whether anyone in the chamber had reached out to the human government to explain what we now understood, and whether there was any chance, however small, that they might reconsider. Nobody had reached out. In the shame and shock of the previous weeks, every delegate, myself included, had been so consumed by what we were losing that none of us had actually done anything about it. I stood, without fully deciding to, and told the chamber that I would go myself. Not as a formal council delegation, not with the weight of diplomatic protocol behind me, but as the person who had led the vote in the first place, and who owed it to every exposed colony to at least ask the question honestly. Ambassador Vale did not stop me. He simply asked me to be honest when I got there, because humans, in his experience, had very little patience left for anything else. I did not yet know how true that would prove to be, or how far I would have to travel to even find someone willing to listen. That night, before I left, Corin Ashwood came to my office one last time. She told me she had found something in her records that she had not mentioned before, because she had not understood its significance until now. Buried in an old maintenance log from a council relay station near the boundary line, there was a note, dated years earlier, describing an informal habit among human crews passing through the checkpoint. Each time, without exception, they had left a small supply cache behind. Food, fuel cells, basic medical kits, tagged simply for anyone who needs it. Nobody had ever asked why. Nobody had ever thanked them for it. It had simply always been there, quietly, the way so much of what they gave us had always simply been there, unasked and unacknowledged, until the day we voted to send it away. I did not leave that night the way I imagined I would, calm and resolved. I left in a borrowed courier ship with my stomach in knots, because somewhere between the private meeting with Ambassador Vale and the moment Corin told me about the supply caches, I had stopped thinking of this as a diplomatic mission and started thinking of it as something closer to a confession I owed to people who had never asked me for one. Before I could reach the boundary line, though, Ambassador Vale asked me to do one more thing first. He wanted a complete accounting, not rumors, not scattered reports, but an actual ledger of everything humanity had quietly done on the Council's behalf during their membership, so that when I stood in front of Dana Rourke, I would understand exactly what I was asking her people to forgive. Petra Lindquist was assigned to help me build it, and for 6 days, we barely left the records annex. What we found did not simply confirm what we already suspected. It expanded it into something far larger than either of us had prepared for. The Varan corridor and the Denar mining routes were only the 2 incidents visible enough to leave a paper trail. Petra began cross-referencing supply requisitions, fuel consumption logs, and crew rotation schedules from the human fleet against Council incident reports going back 15 years, and a pattern emerged that neither of us expected. Dozens of minor emergencies scattered across Council space, a fuel leak on an aging Varan transport that could have stranded 400 colonists in open space, a reactor fault on a Threll research station that would have taken weeks for any official Council rescue vessel to reach, a distress call from a Denar survey team lost in an ice field with failing life support, had all been resolved within hours by human vessels that happened, according to the official record, to simply be in the area. I remember Petra sitting back from her console after the 11th such incident and saying, quietly, that she no longer believed any of it had been coincidence. She believed humanity had built an informal network of coverage so dense and so unassuming that it had functioned, for over a decade, as a second layer of Council security that none of us had ever formally acknowledged, funded, or thanked. The deepest part of the ledger, the part that made my hands shake when I finally read it in full, involved a series of classified operations the human fleet had conducted, entirely on their own authority. Operations that had never been brought before the Council for a vote because, as one internal human communication we recovered from an old Joint Operations archive put it plainly, asking permission would have meant losing the material advantage of speed, and speed, in every one of these cases, was the only thing that had prevented a disaster. There was the biological containment operation we had already uncovered. There was, we now learned, a second one, smaller but no less serious, involving an unstable munitions cache discovered on an abandoned mining platform, diffused and removed by a 2-person human team who never filed so much as an incident report beyond a single line, confirming the site was secure. There was a rescue operation involving a civilian transport that had drifted into a debris field left over from an old asteroid mining accident, its hull slowly failing, its distress beacon too weak for most Council sensors to detect at all. A human patrol vessel had picked up the faint signal purely by chance, diverted from its planned route, and pulled the survivors out less than an hour before the transport's remaining structural integrity gave way entirely. None of these events had ever been publicly credited to humanity. Not because humans had asked for secrecy, Petra pointed out, but because nobody in the Council had ever bothered to ask who was responsible, and humanity had never volunteered the information. They had simply done the work and moved on, the same unburdened way the trade envoy had described. I drafted, that same week, a formal letter of acknowledgement, intending to have it entered into the Council record before my departure, documenting every incident we had uncovered, and formally crediting humanity for services rendered without recognition or compensation for over a decade. I brought it to 3 senior delegates, hoping for support before presenting it to the full chamber. I want to describe honestly what happened next, because it is the part of this account that shames me most. 2 of the 3 delegates I approached, both from species that had voted enthusiastically for the expulsion, refused to support the letter, not because they doubted its accuracy. Petra's research was, by that point, meticulous enough that no one seriously questioned the facts. They refused because formally acknowledging the scale of what we had lost would have meant admitting, on the permanent Council record, that the vote they had championed alongside me had been built on a catastrophic failure to understand what we actually depended on. One of them, a proud and aging delegate named Bertram Ashcombe, told me plainly that the Council's credibility could not survive an admission that large, and that it would be wiser, in his words, to let the matter fade quietly, rather than immortalize our own failure in the official record. I argued with him for nearly an hour, and I will admit that some part of me, the part that had built its entire career on being right in that chamber, understood his fear, even as I rejected his reasoning. Admitting fault publicly meant admitting that my own celebrated speech, the one that had once earned applause across an entire star system, had been built on a foundation of ignorance, so complete that it had endangered colonies I was supposed to be protecting. Ambassador Vale, when I brought the disagreement to him, sided with me, but even his support came with a caution I did not want to hear. He said that pushing the full acknowledgement through the chamber immediately, while the Kryn situation was still actively unfolding and colonies were still frightened, risked turning a moment of necessary humility into a political battle that would consume weeks the exposed borders did not have. He suggested, instead, that the ledger be preserved in full, ready to be entered into the record the moment it would do the most good, and that my immediate priority should remain reaching Dana Rourke, because an apology delivered honestly, in person, would matter more in the end than a document sitting unread in an archive. I did not fully agree with him, but I understood the practical weight of what he was saying, and I let the formal record sit unfinished while I prepared to leave. The ledger, though, I kept with me. Every incident documented in full, every date and location cross-referenced, because I intended to hand Dana Rourke something more than an apology built on vague sentiment. I intended to show her that the council finally understood, in specific and uncomfortable detail, exactly what we had thrown away. Corin Ashwood asked to accompany me on the journey, and I agreed, partly because her instincts had proven sharper than my own throughout this entire process, and partly because I did not want to face what was coming alone. Before we left, she raised one more finding, smaller than the others but somehow more painful for its simplicity. Buried in a routine maintenance record from a council relay station, she had found a note describing a small memorial that human crews had apparently maintained, unofficially, at a checkpoint near the boundary line, honoring 3 of their own personnel lost during one of the containment operations we had just uncovered. The memorial had never been reported to the council. It had never been requested, funded, or even acknowledged. It had simply existed, quietly, the way so much of what humanity had given us had existed, until the very people who tended it were told they were no longer welcome in the room where decisions about their own sacrifice were made. I read that note more than once before we departed, and I understood, more clearly than I had understood anything since the vote, that the ledger Petra and I had built was not simply an accounting of tasks completed. It was a record of a quiet, unspoken promise humanity had kept to the rest of us for over a decade. A promise none of us had ever formally asked for, and one we had repaid, in the end, with 211 votes to send them away. The message reached us before we had even cleared the outer edge of council space, and I remember the exact words on the emergency relay, because I have read them back to myself more times than I care to admit. Adril Hollow has gone dark. All contact lost. I ordered our courier ship to hold position while I requested a full update from Petra Lindquist, who had remained behind to monitor the situation. What she sent back was not a full update, because there was not yet enough information to make one complete. It was a timeline, assembled from fragments, and every fragment made the picture worse than the one before it. 9 minutes. That was how long it had taken. 9 minutes from the first alert of unidentified vessels entering the outer system to the moment the colony's primary communication array went permanently silent. Celaprin's last transmission, sent less than 2 minutes before contact was lost entirely, had been a single request, repeated twice, for any nearby vessel capable of responding. No vessel had been close enough. The joint Varen and Threll monitoring post nearest the colony had confirmed the incursion and immediately requested reinforcement from 3 separate fleets, and every single one of those fleets had reported the same painful truth. Nothing capable of reaching Adrel Hollow in time existed within range. I sat in that courier ship for a long moment after reading the report, unable to make myself respond, because some part of me had still been holding on to the hope that the worst outcome was avoidable, that we still had time to fix what the vote had broken before anyone paid the true price for it. Corin Ashwood, sitting across from me, asked quietly whether we should turn back. I told her no, because turning back would not undo what had already happened, and because the only thing left that might matter now was making certain it did not happen again somewhere else. The full assessment arrived 6 hours later, delivered to the council by a joint survey team that had finally been able to reach the system. I will not describe every detail of what they found, because some things do not need to be repeated to be understood, and because the people of Adrel Hollow deserve to be remembered as more than a list of losses. What matters, for the purpose of this account, is the number that appeared at the bottom of the report, and the silence that number created across the entire council chamber when it was read aloud. Selah Prin was among those lost. She had stayed at her post until the final transmission, coordinating an evacuation of the colony's remaining civilian population toward a set of underground shelters that had never been designed to withstand a sustained assault, because nobody, in over a decade of relative peace, had ever imagined they would need to. I was still en route when Ambassador Vale convened an emergency session to present the findings, and Petra sent me a full recording of it, which I watched alone in the small cabin of our courier ship, somewhere in the empty stretch of space between Council territory and the boundary line. I have never watched anything harder to sit through in my life. Ambassador Vale did not soften the numbers. He read them plainly, the way a person reads something they know they will be asked to account for later. He read the timeline. He read the requests for reinforcement, and the responses confirming none had arrived. He read, finally, the conclusion of the survey team's preliminary assessment, which stated, without any diplomatic cushioning, that a single vessel capable of the response times humanity had routinely provided along that corridor for over a decade would very likely have prevented the incursion from ever escalating past its initial probing stage. I watched delegate after delegate in that recording sit in absolute silence, unwilling or unable to meet the gaze of the presiding officer, and I understood exactly how that silence felt, because I had been feeling it myself for weeks. Bertram Ashcombe, the same delegate who had refused to support my letter of acknowledgement, was shown briefly on the recording, and even from the distance of the recording, I could see that his composure had cracked completely. He did not argue this time. He simply sat, staring at the empty seat where the human ambassador had once stood before the vote that had removed it. Inez Calder, the soft-spoken trade delegate who had first mentioned traders going missing along the corridor, stood and asked the question that I believe every single delegate in that chamber, myself included, had been avoiding since the moment the vote passed. She asked how many more colonies would need to disappear before the council was willing to admit, publicly, and without qualification, exactly what we had done. Nobody answered her, not because the answer was unknown, but because saying it out loud meant accepting a level of responsibility that none of the remaining defenders of the original vote were prepared to bear. Ambassador Vale, to his credit, did not let the silence stand unanswered for long. He said, plainly, that the council would formally acknowledge the ledger of human service that had been compiled over the previous weeks, in full, without editing or softening, and that this acknowledgement would be entered into the permanent record, regardless of how uncomfortable it made anyone in that chamber. He said that Adrel Hollow deserved at least that much honesty, even if it could not undo what had already happened. I arrived at the boundary line 2 days later, and by the time our courier ship crossed into the neutral corridor that separated council space from whatever lay beyond it, the full ledger had already been entered into the permanent council record, exactly as Ambassador Vale had promised. I do not know if that acknowledgement brought any comfort to the families of those lost at Adrel Hollow. I suspect, honestly, that it did not, because acknowledgement arrives too late to matter to the people who needed protection in the moment protection was required, not weeks afterward, in a formal document meant to satisfy the conscience of the people who had failed them. What I do know is that the recording of that session followed me the rest of the way to the boundary line, playing over and over in the quiet of the courier ship's cabin, because I needed to understand exactly what I was carrying with me before I arrived to ask Dana Rourke for anything at all. I was no longer approaching this meeting as a delegate seeking a diplomatic reversal for the council's convenience. I was approaching it as someone who now understood, in specific and irreversible detail, the true size of what a single confident vote had cost an entire colony that had never asked for anything more than the safety it had always, quietly, been given. Corin Ashwood, watching me review that recording for what must have been the 5th time, finally asked me a question I did not have a good answer for. She asked what I intended to say to Dana Rourke that could possibly account for what had happened at Adrel Hollow. I told her the truth, because it was the only thing I had left to offer. I told her I did not know, and that perhaps there was no sentence capable of accounting for it fully, but that I intended to say it anyway, because the alternative, silence, had already cost us everything it was going to cost, and I was not willing to let it cost us the chance to at least try to make things right. The boundary line, when we finally crossed it, did not look like the edge of anything significant. There was no marker, no dramatic shift in the color of space, nothing to indicate that we had left the territory the Council still claimed, and entered a region that now belonged entirely to people who no longer answered to anyone but themselves. And yet the moment our sensors registered the crossing, I felt a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with the ship's environmental systems. We had been given a single contact frequency by a retired Council liaison who had once worked alongside human logistics teams, a frequency he admitted he was not certain would even still be monitored. To my relief, it was. Within an hour of transmitting our identification and a request for contact with Admiral Dana Rourke, we received coordinates for a rendezvous point, and nothing else. No greeting. No confirmation of who would be waiting for us. Just coordinates, and the quiet expectation that we would arrive and explain ourselves. What we found at those coordinates surprised me more than almost anything else in this entire account. I had expected, based on nothing but my own assumptions, that humanity's departure from Council space might have left them diminished somehow, forced to rebuild in unfamiliar territory, without the support structures the Council had once provided. What I found instead was a settlement far larger than I anticipated, a cluster of stations and shipyards arranged around a modest but clearly thriving colony world, humming with an energy that had nothing defensive or embattled about it. If anything, it looked like a civilization that had simply been waiting for room to grow, and had finally been given it. Corin, looking out at the same view, said quietly that it did not look like the home of a people who had been punished by our vote. It looked like the home of a people who had been freed by it, and I did not have a response to that, because I suspected she was right. We were met at the primary station by a young officer who introduced herself simply as Lieutenant Nora Bennett, polite but entirely unimpressed by our diplomatic credentials, and escorted us through a series of corridors that felt cleaner, quieter, and somehow more purposeful than anything I remembered from Joint Council facilities. She did not make conversation. She did not ask why we had come. She simply led us to a private meeting room and told us that the Admiral would arrive shortly, and then she left without another word. Dana Rourke arrived 20 minutes later, and she looked, if anything, less burdened than she had the day she stood before the Council to accept our vote without argument. She sat across from us without any of the ceremony I had grown used to in Council proceedings, and she did not wait for me to begin with formalities. She asked, simply, why I had come. I had rehearsed this moment for the entire journey, and every version of my prepared speech fell apart the moment I actually tried to speak it. I told her, instead, the truth, plainly, and without the careful diplomatic language I had used my entire career. I told her about the missing escorts, the silent channels, the ledger Petra and I had built, documenting over a decade of quiet service the Council had never acknowledged. I told her about the Kryn incursions, the failed attempts to reorganize coverage across the exposed corridor, and finally, because I owed her nothing less than the full truth, I told her about Adrel Hollow. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she did not respond immediately. She simply looked at me for a long moment, the same way she had looked at the Council chamber the day of the vote, patient and unreadable. Then she said something that I did not expect, and that has reshaped how I understand everything that happened afterward. She said humans were not angry about the vote. She said her people had understood, long before the vote ever happened, that a species without a true seat at the table, without a real voice in decisions that affected them, would eventually be asked to leave a table they had never actually been welcome at in the first place. What had hurt, she said, was not the expulsion itself. It was the years leading up to it, the years of quietly protecting borders, diffusing threats, and rescuing strangers, all without ever being asked what they needed in return, all while being described, in the same Council chambers they were protecting, as a danger too great to be trusted. I asked her, as directly as I could manage, whether there was any path toward readmission, any arrangement the Council could offer that might convince her people to return. She was quiet for a long time before answering, and when she did, her answer was not a refusal, but it was not the reassurance I had hoped for either. She said that humanity was not interested in returning to a Council seat that came without genuine partnership, a seat that could be granted or revoked based on fear, rather than mutual respect. She said her people had spent over a decade being useful without being valued, and that if the Council genuinely wanted humanity's protection again, it would need to offer something it had never offered before: real inclusion in the decisions that shaped the borders humanity had always been expected to defend. I told her honestly that I did not know if the Council was capable of that kind of change, but that I intended to try, because the alternative, watching more colonies suffer the way Adral Hollow had suffered, was not something I was willing to accept without at least attempting to fix what my own vote had broken. She studied me for a moment, and something in her expression softened slightly, though not entirely. She said that she appreciated the honesty, more than she had expected to, and that she would take my message back to her own government, though she made no promises about what response it might bring. She said, finally, that if the Council was serious about change, it would need to prove it through action long before humanity would ever consider trusting it through words alone. Before I left, Lieutenant Bennett escorted us briefly past a section of the station I had not expected to see. A modest memorial wall bearing the names of personnel lost during operations I now recognized from the ledger Petra and I had built. Among the names, I recognized several from the containment operations, the rescues, the quiet interventions that had never once been credited publicly. Corin stood beside me in silence, and I understood, looking at that wall, that every name on it represented a debt the Council had never even known it owed, paid quietly, without applause, by people we had called a danger to the rest of us. I left that station without a guarantee, without a treaty, and without the reassurance I had hoped to bring back to Ambassador Vale. What I carried instead was a clearer understanding than I had ever had before of exactly what we had lost, and exactly how far the Council would need to go to earn it back, if earning it back was even still possible at all. The journey back to Vesson Station felt longer than the journey out, though the distance was identical. I spent most of it composing and discarding versions of the report I would need to give the full Council, none of which felt adequate to the weight of what I had seen at the boundary line, and none of which felt honest enough to satisfy the promise I had made to Dana Rourke before leaving her station. Ambassador Vale convened the full Council the day after our return, and this time, there was no applause waiting for me when I stood to speak, no confident chamber, eager to hear a decisive verdict. There was only a room full of delegates who had spent the previous weeks learning, in the most painful way possible, exactly how much they had misunderstood about the people they had voted to remove. I told the Council everything, without softening any of it. I described the thriving colony humanity had built beyond the boundary line, unburdened and growing exactly as Dana Rourke had described. I described her answer to my request for readmission, the clear and unflinching condition that humanity would not return to a seat granted or revoked based on fear, only to one built on genuine partnership. I described the memorial wall, the names of people who had died protecting borders they had never been thanked for defending, and I watched several delegates who had voted for the expulsion lower their eyes rather than meet mine. Bertram Ashcombe, who had once refused to support my letter of acknowledgement, stood near the end of my report and said something I had not expected from him. He said that he had spent the weeks since Adral Hollow trying to find a version of events in which the Council's decision could still be defended as reasonable, and that he had failed, completely, to find one. He said the failure was not simply a matter of unlucky timing or unforeseeable circumstance. It was a failure of imagination, a refusal, shared by nearly every delegate in that chamber including himself, to seriously ask what a species that had clawed its way out of a dying world through centuries of hardship might actually be capable of protecting, rather than only what it might be capable of destroying. I told the Council that I believed the nightmare we had spent 11 years fearing had never actually been humanity itself. The nightmare, I said, was our own blindness, our comfortable assumption that someone else was quietly handling the hardest and most dangerous parts of galactic survival, so completely that we never once had to look directly at what that protection actually cost the people providing it. We had mistaken quiet competence for hidden threat, because it was easier to fear strength we did not understand than to sit with the discomfort of depending on someone we had never bothered to truly know. Ines Calder asked what I believed the Council's next step should be, and I told her honestly that I did not have a simple answer, because Dana Rourke had made clear that words alone, however sincere, would not be enough. I proposed, instead, a concrete first step, a formal offer of genuine partnership, Not a symbolic seat that could be revoked by fear at the next uncomfortable vote, but a structural role in council security decisions, with humanity's judgment carrying real weight in exactly the kind of border assessments that had, for over a decade, depended entirely on their willingness to act without ever being consulted. The proposal did not pass easily. There were delegates, even after everything that had happened, who resisted the idea of granting any single species that much influence over shared decisions, and I understood their hesitation, even as I argued against it, because it was the same instinct that had driven the original vote, the discomfort of trusting a power we did not fully understand. But the vote, when it finally came, passed by a wide margin, wider than I expected, carried largely by delegates from the border systems who had learned, in the most direct way possible, exactly what the alternative looked like. I do not know, as I record this account, whether Dana Rourke's government will accept the offer, or whether it will be seen as too little, delivered too late, after a colony had already paid the price the council had refused to imagine paying itself. I sent the formal proposal through the same contact frequency that had first connected us at the boundary line, along with a personal message that contained no diplomatic language at all, only an honest acknowledgement that the council had finally understood, however painfully, exactly what it had lost, and exactly why losing it had mattered. I think often, now, about the observation deck where I once stood and felt something like pride, watching human ships fold quietly out of council space, while I believed I was witnessing the galaxy become safer. I understand now that what I was actually watching was a wall being dismantled by the very people it had always protected, none of us realizing the wall existed until the moment it was gone, and the things it had been holding back began, quietly, and then not so quietly, to arrive. I do not know what the coming months will bring. I do not know whether the border systems that survived the weeks after the withdrawal will continue to survive whatever the Kryn ascendancy decides to attempt next, or whether other threats we never knew existed will find, in the quiet left behind, the same opportunity the Kryn found. What I know is that the nightmare the galaxy feared was never the arrival of a human warship. It was the silence left behind when that warship was asked to leave, and the slow, agonizing realization of everyone who had cheered its departure that the silence had never meant safety at all. If there is a lesson in this account, and I believe there must be one, worth the cost it took to learn it, it is simply this: a civilization that has never had to fight for its own survival should be very careful before it decides to judge and expel the one civilization among us that has already fought for exactly that, and quietly chosen, for over a decade, to fight for the rest of us as well, without ever once asking to be thanked for it. I do not know what price the council will ultimately have to pay to invite that nightmare back into the room. I only know, standing where I stand now, that the true nightmare was never humanity at all. It was believing we could survive without them, and discovering, far too late for the people of Adrel Hollow, exactly how wrong that belief had been.